I would like to start in about 1 minute, so I'll give you notice. We'll begin in 1 minute, please. I like it. We got stuff here. Life is good.
I don't know. Let's get through today and then we'll see.
We're going to do this one day at a time, see how it goes.
I may have used it once or twice, not often.
Well, good morning again, everybody, and welcome. I see everyone is present today on council. Thank you very much. Lots of smiling faces for the moment, so we'll proceed with our happy faces here. This is our beginning of the 2018 operating tax levy budget deliberations. I am going to try to keep things going as fast as I possibly can, so that we can meet our deadline of this Friday, hopefully. But we'll take it. We'll worry about today for now. Just some housekeeping to start things off. First of all, reminder of your cell phones if they make a noise. If you could have a look at that. Again, I must remind you we're televised in these sessions and web streamed. Bill Jackson and Judy Ann McCauley will be volunteering over the next 3 days to assist with the televising, the broadcasting, I should say. I saw Judy Ann here this morning. Thank you very much, Judy Ann, for your time today. We have a 9 o'clock start, which we have done, but I would like to get a consensus from council that we go. My suggestion is no later than 4 o'clock today. Certainly you councilors can tell me what you wish. Can I have a show of hands that would agree at 4 o'clock at the latest? Okay, I have a consensus there that we will conclude today at 4 o'clock at the latest. Any different, you can let me know. These 3 days, it is a session of council. That means for motions, I will definitely need a mover and a seconder. Aside from that, our meetings will certainly be more informal than we normally are at a council meeting. You can remain seated. I mean, if you want to stand to talk, you can. I'm not going to stop you, but you certainly can remain seated. And we will have no written motions for the budget session. So just a mover and seconder will suffice. Keep things going. Councilors certainly will be allowed to go back and revisit any item prior to the bylaw being passed at the conclusion of the budget session. So if you miss something you wish to address the first time through, you certainly have a second chance at the conclusion to revisit anything that you wish. Just as a matter of procedure, since we are reviewing both the county 2018 operating budget and the Haldeman Norfolk Board of Health 2018 operating budget, I will open both sessions this morning and recess one to deal with the other, and vice versa over the 3 days, just to make it easy to go back and forth if required. So, having said that, I will be following the order of business as printed here on the agenda for today's meeting, and tomorrow and Friday if needed. Okay? You don't have one? You find it? Okay. Yeah, everyone have one. Otherwise, I have an extra one here. Yeah. Thanks, Maureen. I think they all have one now. Thank you. I know there's lots of paper. Believe me, I know I'll be scrambling at times. So, having said that, I will now open the Board of Health budget meeting. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest on the Board of Health? Seeing none, I will now recess the 2018 Board of Health budget meeting, and I will now open the county operating budget meeting. Are there any declarations to declare on that? At this point, I see none. So, we are now in the council budget meeting session. I will start with a few very, very brief comments from myself, and then I'll turn it over to our CAO, Mr. Cribbs. Following that, did I lose James? No, he's still here. James and his crew is at the back, and then I'll turn it over for your presentation right after the conclusion of our Chief Administrative Officer's comments. And also, I just wanted to say we certainly will be having a break this morning somewhere around 10:30, and then lunch when it gets here, and away we go. Okay, so just a few things, and as I said, my comments will be very short this morning. I'm most interested in getting right to our tabs and inside the binder, and I get on with this session. We've been here before, all of us, so we know what is required. Council is being, this year, asked by our staff to consider a 2018 net levy requirement of approximately $85 million. This is an increase in dollar value of 7% over last year's budget that Council approved at roughly $79.5 million. And as all of us are aware, approximately 80% of our tax revenue comes from the residential portion of the levy. This budget before us at the onset, as proposed, would create a percentage increase in taxes for 2018 to our homeowners in the neighborhood of roughly 4%. This budget, as all budgets, is about the services we wish to continue, services we might wish to add, and services we might wish to eliminate this year. It basically boils down to spending dollars to provide services that we feel as a council are important for this county. The final increase in the levy, I hope, is something that we, the elected officials, will be able to sleep with at night. But more important, a final increase that, for the most part, our citizens can live with. To Mr. Cribbs and our general managers and to all staff, on behalf of council, I thank you for your hard work and the preparation of this budget. And I think it's put together extremely well, Mr. Johnson, so I say thank you. This budget now, this morning, is in the hands of council. This council now owns it, and we will also own the final outcome. It is 100% our responsibility from this point on. Mr. Cribbs, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Your Worship. So these are going to be a couple of difficult days with some hard decisions. At the administrative level, Norfolk County offers training to its staff. One of our products is something called Having Courageous Conversations. It's a remarkably effective tool that teaches people how to do exactly that, to have conversations about things either they don't want to talk about, or that are going to be awkward or difficult, possibly if they're not handled properly, involves some emotional hurt and damage. And in a very real way, we're about to engage in an ongoing courageous conversation for the next 2 days. And part of my message this morning is certainly going to qualify under that heading of a courageous conversation. What we're doing here involves a lot of stress on all parties. It is you, as council and individuals, are put in a, well, it's not your first rodeo, but frankly, you're put in a bind. No one likes paying taxes. No one wants to pay more than they have to. Who enjoys the tax bill? No human being. And the public makes that clear to you. We all understand that. Conversely, you have staff making impassioned pleas and putting forward generally solid business cases that support the notion of raising taxes to spend on initiatives that they feel, that we feel, add value and are going to be effective in delivering either things we're legally obligated to or that are council approved. And somehow you have to sort through all that and come to whatever it is we're going to come to. One of the things I'd ask you to keep in mind is that this budget as presented to you, you can agree with it wholeheartedly, and I welcome you to bring one motion to pass it as is, and we can go home in about 15 minutes. But if that's not on the table, I do ask you to keep in mind that this is the cumulative work of thousands of hours across this corporation, and it does represent the fundamental duty of your senior management team is to bring you a document that accurately reflects the amount of money we think it takes to run this corporation. You're under no obligation to agree with that. You can increase spending, you can decrease spending, you can move it around, you have a number of options before you, but this does reflect cumulatively our best advice and what we happen to believe is required to deliver on the service levels that are expected by the community. As far as that goes, that is absolutely correct. Your interpretation of it is entirely your own. Okay, I have sort of 3 items I'd like to hit on before I pass the baton over to finance. They are generally some remarks on efficiency and process, generally some remarks on our corporate resiliency or lack thereof, and generally some remarks about a revenue problem this corporation faces. With respect to efficiency and process, and this is the most courageous part of the conversation, please understand, and please accept that these remarks are given in the spirit of loyalty and service to you. But on the efficiency side, I'd like to make it abundantly clear that it costs us $3,500 an hour to run a council meeting. At Finance run the numbers, that's on average. A day like today will be slightly higher, some council meetings slightly lower, but it works out to $3,500 an hour for a council meeting. We're going to be here about 2 days. Last year we were here about 4. So right there, assuming we get this done inside of 2 days, that's a good thing. But I say this to you in light of the fact that occasionally we have a tendency to go down a rabbit hole to a level of specificity and detail that is uncommon. And at $3,500 an hour, that means we spend almost $600 every 10 minutes. We cannot spend 10 minutes talking about a $200 item. Whether you approve it or don't approve it, you spent it 3 times that just talking about it. This is why, as a broad narrative, and we try to encourage the best value this council can ever provide is the big decisions, the strategic pieces, the hard choices. The minutiae, the smaller items, are really ultimately why you have a professional managerial team. You have a CAO, 6 general managers, and a management team below them, several of whom are quite good at trying to find business and operating efficiencies, and you can assume that they'll get the right kind of pens or a good deal on paper for the photocopiers or what have you. Those aren't good value-added items. The big picture items really are, though, and that's where we can't make those decisions, only you can, and why we're trying to keep the discussion and focus at a higher level. Because it's $3,500 an hour to run this meeting, and it's almost $600 every 10 minutes. So one of the reasons we try to keep it up at a sort of a higher level. Related to that is the notion of, so that's the efficiency side. On process, I'd like to just give you my 2 cents in, this is my first budget with you, and I'm going to learn a lot from the interaction, and what I've seen elsewhere, what I know happens to work, is questions during the budget that deal with, like I said earlier, the bigger points. Good questions are, why do we spend money on this? What benefit does this expenditure provide? What's the implication of cutting this expenditure? Figuring out the how and the whys of where we're getting. Unfortunately, during our capital budget back in October, we had two motions that were brought to cut things, and after the fact, the question was asked, what's the implication? That's the wrong order. We should not bring motions to cut things and then try to figure out what the implications are after the motion. To the extent we should investigate, and then, if you feel it's appropriate, bring a motion to cut, or to increase for that matter. But that's the right order to do those things in, and I'd ask to keep that in mind so that we don't end up with motions that have unintended consequences. I'd like to talk a little bit, if I may, about resiliency. This community has a lot of it. It's lived through a great decline in tobacco. It's taken years. We still have a tobacco industry. But it took years to readjust the agricultural model, the nature of what's grown, to adjust to that, a very big change in the shutdown of a number of cigarette manufacturers in the area and a change in demand. This area also went, like the rest of the country and really the rest of the globe, went through a big crash in 2008. We've taken two strong gut punches this millennium, and we're only 18 years into the thing. The people have learned to bounce back, and happily, all the data you've heard from Mr. Baird, from myself, and from others, growth is up, population is up, income is up. We've bounced back. The community has resiliency, has weathered two bad storms, and is really coming out of it in a very great way. It's wonderful to see. The corporation, however, does not have resiliency. And if I was going to offer you a negative critique of just the legal entity now, but the Corporation of Norfolk County has no capacity to take a punch in the gut. The last year, for which we have complete data, because we still can't do variance reporting, and we're working towards that, but the reality is 2016 is the last year I can give you complete data for. I cannot tell you right now if we finished in the black or the red for 2017. And while I apologize for that, 2016 is what we have, and we know we finished $3 million in the red. What that means is that in 2015, we passed a budget that increased taxes by 2 point something. Our finance department will show you those numbers in a little bit. But really, we spent $3 million more than we took in, and that means that year we should have increased the taxes by another 4.2%. Should have been a 6 and change tax increase that year. Because every roughly $800,000 is a point increase. We were $3 million in the hole, and they're right around 4% more we needed. I don't know what the number is for last year, but the point of the resiliency is that our budgets are designed to cover the things we know are going to happen and nothing more. And the reality is, unless you're exceptionally impecunious and really struggling, in which case you never have enough money to make ends meet and you have to sort of live on a credit card, your household budget, you allow some amount of money each month for the stuff you don't know. And we don't have, this corporation doesn't have that, and it doesn't have that for a very good reason. Because we've had a very hard, more than a decade, this council and previous councils have done the only appropriate thing. You put the corporation on a huge, strong diet. You took as little money from the population as you possibly could while it was really struggling, and frankly, that's commendable both to this council and the previous ones. But what else are you going to do when tobacco goes down? What else are you going to do in a global economic slowdown? So by taking that money out, what it means is when someone in the cemetery operations breaks a shovel, we've got to go buy, and we don't have money for a new shovel. And when the microwave in the kitchen goes down, we don't have money for a new, and so it goes. And writ large, we end up $3 million in the hole. For the last year, I can give you complete data. We don't have corporate resiliency because we don't have huge pockets of fat, because you and previous councils have done exactly what this community needed you to do, which was put the corporation on a diet and give it as few resources as you humanly could. But after years and years of starving, what I can say is the corporation hasn't had an infusion. And so we all know and understand that a 0% increase is a decrease because it doesn't even take into account inflation. But the hard news and the hard statement I have to make to you is that if you come in at 2%, it's still going to be a cut. We know we are short. We have been short. We've had 4 years running in the red, where each year it hasn't taken in enough to cover the amount of money needed to operate the corporation. And what happens at the end of each of those years is we go into our reserves, and we've reduced the reserves last year, and we reduced the reserves the year before, and we reduced the reserves the year before that. It's either we take the revenue from the existing taxpayer, or we use revenues from years prior, which is what the reserves are, right? They're accumulated savings. So right now, this corporation doesn't have resiliency. It can't roll with the punches, and we end up in the red at the end of the year. You had a very good reserves report in July of last calendar year, and it sort of set out, we finally got good data, a proper state of the union, a good look at where we stand. And I don't want to belabor the point, but you'll recall how many of them are in the red versus in the black where we want them to be. And that's the sort of proof positive of the resiliency problem. The resiliency problem then feeds into the last thing I'd like to say, or the last important point I want to leave you with, which is our revenue problem. The reserves are down. Our level of service, thank you, Province of Ontario, hasn't gone down this millennium. Every year, this year alone, we're now operating what were known as the Ontario Early Years Centres. That's a whole new area now of municipal jurisdiction. Every year there's a new program that we're going to deliver on their behalf. Our service keeps going up, whether we like it or not. That's where the law has gone. We keep doing more. No choice in that. I'd like to bring you back. There are really two main points on our revenue problem. The first has to do with that graph. Can we call that up on the screens? And the point of that graph is coming, there we are. Norfolk's at the far left. Our spending is in line with other municipalities that are similar to us. So you're 30 to 99,000 people, a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger, but these are really municipalities like us at the end of the day. You can be, and you ought to be, extremely proud that you're at the far left. But you can't get farther left than the far left, right? We have the lowest revenue relative to our comparators. That's the nature of the revenue problem, because our expenditures, mostly provincially mandated, some council approved, but regardless, the things this community wants and needs are more or less in line with everywhere else. It's not the expenditures, it's not the cost side. We can't cost cut our way to profitability with required service provision levels. We know we don't have the highest wages in the province of Ontario. Our stated aim is to hit the 50th percentile, and we're not 100% certain we're at the 50th, but that's our goal, is to be average as far as costs go, since our number one cost is wages and our stated goal is to be in the middle. It's not that. It's revenue. It's us at the far left. If we're pickering at the far right, you'd have every reason not to be proud. You'd have the highest taxes relative to population. Also, I suppose we'd all be earning a bunch more and things would be, you know, we'd come in here easy peasy on a budget and ask you for 1.5 points and carry on. It is a revenue problem. This is an easy graphical representation of that. The other thing I want to bring your attention to or have you recall was the Standard & Poor's report we received last year. To be abundantly clear, Standard & Poor's are financial bankers and analysts on Wall Street. They are at the heart of the global financial system, and they're literally Manhattan. And they come from a country that just celebrated a huge, massive tax cut, and its whole ethos is about not paying taxes. And people from Wall Street who analyzed us had this to say: we could take a positive rating action, i.e. your credit rating would go up. If revenue flexibility improves, that's taxes. Revenue for us is taxes. And by improve, they mean increase. From the limited ability and willingness, respectfully, that's you, your willingness, what you feel is your ability to raise taxes, to adjust modifiable revenues, again, that's taxes. We actually have Wall Street analysts calling for taxing, saying that they could give us a better credit rating. Our costs will go down if we would fix our, because they understand we're at the far left of this graph. Now, the interesting thing, no one's here suggesting a 10% across the board increase, but take a look at that graph on your screen. We're at $2,200 and change for a $222,000 house, $220,000 house. And if you go up a whole 10%, which no one is suggesting or requesting, but you're still at the far left of the graph, you would still have the lowest revenue. That's where we're at. If you went up a whole 10%, you're still the lowest tax burden jurisdiction of reasonable comparator. There are very small places in Ontario that pay less taxes, absolutely. I'm not saying the lowest tax rate in the province of Ontario, but very, very small jurisdictions that offer almost no services aren't reasonable comparators, nor is the city of Toronto or Hamilton. You've got to sort of look apples to apples, and in an apples to apples fair way, we're at the far left. We're not suggesting moving off the far left. It does well by our citizens. We provide good value for money here. And I believe it's a competitive advantage. But we are at the far left. This corporation is starving for some revenue. It's last year where I can give you complete data. We finished $3 million in the red. That's roughly 4% off the levy. And so it shouldn't be too surprising that we come in here with a budget that says 7 gross. It works down to less than that for the average residential. We're in the 4 range. But because we know that the last year for which we have complete data, we were short 4. To make this simple in my own mind, because we're a big corporation with a lot of moving parts, I always come back to the legal spend. We budgeted $350 each of the last 2 years for which we have complete data, and we spent more than $520 each of those years on legal services. Was that a spending problem? No. It was an unrealistic budget each year. A corporation this size does need to spend about $500,000 on lawyers. No one celebrates that fact, no one loves that fact, but it is a reality. I'm very glad this council approved the new county solicitor position. I'm utterly confident we're going to deliver some savings on that. But you look at that as a great example. We say it's not a $350,000 expense. That should have been adjusted many years ago, and every year it should, and it never got adjusted. And yet the expenditure was more than $500, so each year it went about $200,000 over, just the last 2 years. That's $400,000 unbudgeted expense, because we have no resiliency. We haven't been adjusting the numbers. This is the year. Now is the time. The residents of Norfolk have never been this well off. Population growth, real employment growth, real wage growth, and I'm not just talking the top 1%, our data carries that out, $140 million worth of development. new residents, all of it. Sterling numbers. This council and previous councils reacted appropriately in very bad times. They made very hard decisions, which were the right thing for the community. The community now is prospering. This corporation is in need. With that concept and in light of those facts, I'd like to turn the baton over, if I may, to Finance, and thank you for your time and consideration. Good luck.
Thank you, Mr. Cribbs. Mr. Johnson? We'll go to this next.
Yes, that's correct.
Your presentation, would you like to go through it? Would you like questions as we go through it page by page? It's your call. We can do it either way.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I believe questions while we go through the
We will
presentation
do that.
is
Turn it
acceptable.
over to you. Thank you, sir.
Before Kathy goes into the presentation, I'd like to say a few small things. So first of all, good morning, Mr. Mayor and members of council. We are going to be here for 2 days, possibly 3, depending on how things go. So I'd like to thank you for spending the time with us. I'd like to do a brief introduction. To my right is Kathy LaPlante, and without her, we would not be here today. She is 100% responsible for the binders and pulling all the information together before you today, and also her staff, of course. To my left, Cindy Jacobs. She's the supervisor of financial reporting and planning, who supervises 4 advisors who are an integral part of the budget process. And to her left, Chris Everett is one of those advisors, and he'll be tracking what we will be, any adjustments throughout the next few days. He'll be tracking them on the screen for you and in front of you on the monitors. You'll be able to see it in real time. No introductions really are needed for the CAO or the general managers around you today. However, I would like to thank all of them as well for putting up with finance over the last 3 or 4 months to get where we are today. Without the cooperation of everybody in this room and their staff, we wouldn't be able to provide you the document before you. Kathy's presentation will be streamlined from previous years, mainly due to the special budget meeting we had on November 23rd. At that meeting, we were able to identify early major budget drivers facing Norfolk in 2018. We were also able to give an economic update specific to Norfolk County, thanks to Chris Baird. We were also able to do a presentation on the One Fund, where there will be a report on that but at the end of February, early March. We were able to provide explanations on the budget process and to give communication on changes that we're going to be doing. We identified provincial downloading and other budget pressures, and we also got guidance from council on issues to address. A good example of that guidance was the, sorry, where did my speech go? Sorry about that. A good example of that guidance was the Bill 148 with the minimum wage issue. We were able to have a good discussion about it in November, and we brought Mr. Slichenkov brought a very good report, and Aaron as well, in just last week, and we were able to identify what we wanted to do with that issue. So that saved a tremendous amount of time that we have to talk about it over the next couple days. As well as Mr. Cribbs, this is also my first budget process as treasurer of Norfolk County. And preparing for this budget, I tried to educate myself on Norfolk's budget process, as well as the historical rate increases. There's two main things that I'd like to share in that research. The first thing is staff from both finance and respective divisions spend months scrubbing the accounts to ensure the budgets are not artificially inflated and accurate for 2018. Mr. Cribbs touched on that already, so I won't get into a lot of details. However, we do have systematic processes in place when determining budget amounts. We use tools such as 3 or 5 year averages to ensure nothing is out of whack. There's also a good separation of duties when preparing the budget. We have staff that prepare the budget, and we have separate staff that review the budget. And then after that staff reviews the budget, then SLT reviews the budget. So it does go through a very detailed process before it comes to you today. Long story short, it's a solid document. There's also a little bit of creativity put into it. I'll give you two very good examples. Ms. Robinson was able to save close to $700,000 by combining two contracted services when it comes to waste pickup. And also we were able to hire a lawyer with no levy impact. That's incredible all on its own, hiring a lawyer with no added expense. Second item is I looked at the historical tax increases. As Mr. Cribbs mentioned, we've been on a diet. That's a very good way to put it. I almost like to say through attrition, we have a skinny budget just through attrition of low tax increases. And those increases, you could say, well, they represent the consumer price index. Our increases, if you look at, there's going to be a graph coming up, it hovers around what the CPI would be. Unfortunately, with municipalities, when we have issues like infrastructure gapping, or we take on services like diverting our waste to Brampton, I believe it's Brampton, those are added services that the CPI just doesn't incorporate. So while we have tax increases relative to CPI, it doesn't incorporate added services or other significant changes that happen with the county. Some symptoms of these modest increases or the diet that we've been on. We have depleted reserves, as mentioned. We have increased debt. We have the infrastructure gap. We have multiple years of operating deficits, including what Mr. Cribbs mentioned, the $3 million. That's obviously the most significant we've had in a while, but we've had other deficits as well. And as the CEO mentioned, there's no contingency built in to our budget to incorporate these deficits, to try to prepare for them. And these are nothing new. We talked about this in July with the reserves. We talked about this year over year whenever we do the budget, whenever we do the budget deliberations. And as Mr. Cribbs mentioned, I also agree there are years where low tax increases are warranted, absolutely. However, having 5 to 7 years of straight low tax increases, it doesn't mean that we're treading water, we're sinking. So I admit the budget that before you today is asking a substantial levy increase compared to previous years. And there's never a right time for this. There's as Mr. Cribbs mentioned again, you get pressures from the public all the time for tax increases. Nobody likes tax increases. However, given the growth in assessment, the building permits that are coming in, the average household income is up, the unemployment rate is down, this isn't the wrong time. So having said that, I am going to turn it over to Kathy LaPlante, and she will go through the slide deck for the budget deliberations today. And as mentioned by Mr. Mayor, if there's any questions to any of us, please feel free to ask them as we go.
Thank you. Councillor Block?
Mr. Mayor, thank you. To James, how do we deal with the year-end deficits?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Black. It's a very good question. There's a lot of answers for that. With the year-end deficits, with the 2016 report for the audited financial statements, for the first time, I believe, for my knowledge, we included a top 10 list of why we had the deficit. So that's the start. Where Mr. Cribbs mentioned we don't do variance reporting right now. We just didn't have the staff levels to do it. previously. Now we're trying to get there. We have some very good advisors with us right now, and we do plan on doing variance reporting where we can identify these deficits earlier and then perhaps act on them. However, in the top 10 list, if you were to go back and look at it, there wasn't anything really that, there wasn't one particular item that was the main reason. It was a lot of small items. So that tells me that we need to incorporate some contingencies in our budgets, and to, I don't want to say that we're not budgeting accurately, because we are. However, there are things that come up and we don't have the funds in place to react to them. Looking forward, if we are to have the reserves where we want them to be, and back to that July report, we're taking an excellent step this year by increasing those reserves. There are a lot of reserves in the red that after 10 years, with our 10-year capital plan, they do go into the black. So that was an excellent decision made. But we're not done yet. There's other ones that are still going to be in the red that you'll find out with our next reserve report. We're going to do a reserve report annually. It's one of the things that we decided to do. So with that strategy, with the variance report strategy, and hopefully building in some contingencies, as well as other factors, all of those things combined, we will be able to prevent future deficits.
You, Councillor Height.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I must have missed that in the $600 answer, but where do we get the money from when there is a $3 million deficit? And do you expect to have a deficit in 2017 as well?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Height, that's an excellent question. When we have a deficit, according to the Municipal Act, Section 290, we're supposed to absorb it the following year. So, for example, we had a $3 million deficit in 2016. Technically, for the 2017 budget, we're supposed to expense that. However, we have a contingency reserve, and that contingency reserve had approximately $6.5 million in it before the 2016 deficit, and now it's half that. So when we have a deficit or a surplus, the contingency reserve is adjusted based on that.
Do you expect us to, I don't know, deplete the contingency reserve completely after 2017? Or is it too early to tell just yet?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, Councillor Height, unfortunately it is too early to tell. Even if we had variance reporting for 2017, the second week, third week of January for any municipality is too early to tell where you're at.
Thank you for that.
Good question, thank you. Kathy, ready to go? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. As James indicated, this presentation is going to be relatively short. It includes highlights from the budget document that you received a few weeks ago. If you have any questions during the presentation, please stop and ask any questions. We'll be able to probably go through pretty quickly because Mr. Cribbs and Mr. Johnson have touched on many of the slides, or a number of the slides, so that'll be good, and we can get right into dealing with the budget document. Today, just a couple of housekeeping items. Today you received the agenda on your desk. Staff from all the divisions and departments will be available as we move through the agenda to answer any questions directly related to their budgets. The other item that you received on your desk was a copy of a new budget initiative that was not included in the document for the library board. Heather will be here tomorrow, Ms. King will be here tomorrow to do her presentation. So we wanted to make sure you had that information ahead of her presentation. The other item we left on your desk was a revised total community services document. It's page 4-84. The only thing that's changed on this document is the salaries and benefit forecasted actuals. We now have some better information, and staff took some time and re-looked at their forecast for salaries and benefits so that it's more in line what the actuals what they're going to forecast for the end of the year. The other item, Mr. Mayor had also indicated that we'll be having some breaks and lunch, and I just wanted to make sure everyone knows that lunch today will be provided by staff from Norview. Right. So, getting into the presentation, the first table illustrates that Norfolk County is not a small business. We are a very large corporation. We have, as you see at the bottom line, our municipal operating capital budgets total over $228 million. We've approved a capital budget to date for $38.4 million for the replacement of tangible capital assets and for new and enhancements to address growth. Overall, for the forecast, Council has reviewed and approved, in essence, the capital plan over $362 million. Our net value of our assets, I believe on the last financial statements, was approximately $550 million. So Norfolk County has a lot of capital assets and infrastructures that we take care of, that we own, and we need to replace. We also provide a high level of services and a number of different services. The water and sewer one is another area of a service level that we provide to those who are connected to water and wastewater. We passed that budget back in November. That amount we passed was just over $17.9 million. Now we're at into the last budget for 2018. The levy-supported operating budget is basically the budget for our day-to-day operations. At times, we are working and looking forward in the future to having multiple year budgets for the operating budget. It basically takes care of our day-to-day operations, and it also provides funds to finance some capital expenditures, and it incorporates the user fees that Council passed back in November also. Given that within the proposed budget, we have expenditures totaling over $155.9 million. That is not including the requests for operating capital costs from boards and agencies. They include the Library Board, Police, and the Conservation Authorities. The request is approximately $16.1. Again, overall, Norfolk County's total municipal operating capital budgets for 2018 total over $228 million. So again, we're not a small corporation.
Councillor Brunton, go ahead, questions?
A quick question to you, to Kathy. Kathy, in our capital budget, how much? Can you refresh my memory? How much tax levies in that capital budget of that 38 million, roughly? And I guess the second part of that question is, there's none of those projects have moved ahead if they have tax levy in them. Am I correct on that?
Through the Mayor to Councillor Brunton, in the last tab is a listing of the capital budgets or capital projects that are levy funded, and within, James is just going to have a look for me here about the total amount, but anything that from the capital budget that came forward that was levy funded had been included in the preliminary budget and the proposed budget. During that time, staff have reviewed the requests, and there are a number of projects that we reviewed some reserve balances, and we were able to find funds to fund those projects so that it didn't have to affect the levy. And then again, there are some that are still included in the budget that need to be levy funded because we have no other sources of funding.
Well, and you say you've done that since we passed the capital?
Yes, we have, and we'll be going through that throughout the process.
Okay,
Yeah.
I just wanted a rough figure on the 38 million. That's what I was looking for.
1.15 million.
Okay, and am I correct that none of those, and that's the revised figure that you've done? Correct? You just said you revised that?
Yes, that's the revised figure.
Okay, and am I correct that any of those projects that are tax levy funded still don't move ahead until they're after this budget, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next slide, we'll just pass. Mr. Cribbs actually did a very good review of the BMA study and where Norfolk County falls within that, within the study. The next slide, for the tax rates, there are a number of items that affect the tax rates, that being the levy requirement or the levy request, changes in assessment and taxation, and our education rates. The changes in taxation, or sorry, assessment, there's three different areas why the assessment changes. That's because of revised current value assessments that have been completed for 2018. It also includes growth in assessment for new properties, less any adjustment for assessment appeals. The growth in assessment for new properties for Norfolk County equates to approximately 3% in raw assessment, which translate to approximately $1 million in new tax levy monies, or 1.32% in growth. The other area that affects the tax rate are the education rates. And when we were doing when we did the proposed budget, the document you received, we did not include any reduction in tax rates. At the time, we felt this may be the year that education tax rates would not be reduced. Since that time, we have a little bit more information, and throughout the next slides, you'll see some of the results. We have received some information. The other item to take into consideration is the tax rates. And the tax impacts are preliminary. The numbers that you're seeing today, they may change because taxes are not actually finalized until April, and if there's a change in any of our tax policies, that could affect the preliminary rates that we've presented to you today. Just a comment about reassessment.
Okay, Councillor Black, sorry, Kathy.
Well, I'd like to ask a question on the growth and assessment, and I know around the table and many, many people always say to me, you know, we need growth because it's actually making money. It makes us money. In fact, does growth make us money or cost us money? Because we still have to provide an increased level of service. So, you know, when I look at the overall taxes, they don't provide the amounts that we need because we have to look at federal provincial funding and user fees to offset it. So just, I want to know, you know, in fact, does growth actually make us money or cost us money?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Black. Growth is always good. And Mr. Cribbs is waving at me, so perhaps I'll start with him.
I was going to wait till you're done to recognize him, but Mr. Cribbs, comment?
The key thing to keep in mind is that 80% of our property tax comes from residential. So I'll confine my remarks to residential, since that's the overwhelming majority. Our residential tax rates are set so that, on average, they pay for themselves. It is true that if you build a 10,000 square foot home, it will pay more in property tax than a 1,000 square foot home will, and it won't use 10 times as much services, assuming everyone uses the toilet about the same amount and everyone dials 911 about the same amount. But overall, as a class, every time we add a house, we add roughly that much in cost in providing servicing, whether it's use in our libraries or arenas, whether it's 911 calls, whether it's sanding new roads in new subdivisions, what have you. So there's no profit. There's also designed not to be any loss. On an individual house, a smaller house may get a larger house will pay slightly more, but as a class, it covers itself, and that's how our rates are designed. And then commercial, industrial, and farm will have slight asterisks beside them, or treated slightly differently. But no profit, no loss. It holds its own as a class.
Kathy?
Okay, for the next slide, the reassessment for 2016-17 16 for the years 2017 and 20. I had mentioned that in the earlier slide. These increases are phased over 4 years, and the decreases are effective immediately. The CVA for 2018 over the taxation year of 2017 is actually considered an inflationary increase or an inflationary dollars, and they're not treated as assessment growth. So when we're talking about the revised base rates, these rates are base rates from 2017 are revised to take into consideration the impact of revised CVAs. It basically eliminates the potential windfall that tax revenue from increased CVAs or funding or net levy requirements. It basically results in a revenue neutral impact on the changes in the CVAs. The next slide you saw during the presentation on November 23rd. I just wanted to point out here, or we'd like to point out here, we're at the end, council review. So it's a long process. We started back in June, and we've continued to today, so hopefully we can finish it off within 2 days. So.
Would you say that again? This is certainly the beginning of the end, as you say, yes.
For 2018, that's for sure. So,
2 days now.
So basically, the process, like I mentioned, starts in June, and it goes, and we're here today. And what's happened to date is staff have prepared a preliminary budget for SLT. They reviewed the services provided. They reviewed any contract increases, CPI. They reviewed all their base budget information. They've included council's directions on a number of items, any council-approved initiatives, and they've also included some new budget initiatives that they feel the community and council should consider. Given that, so that was presented to SLT, and the levy amount at that time was 86.4, which represented an 8.5 levy impact or a 5.2% residential impact. That's without any change in the education rates. SLT reviews the preliminary budget. They reduced the budget by $1.2 million for, again, a levy impact of 7% or 4% as a residential tax impact. Since that time, we have received some information from the Ministry on Education tax rates, and it's estimated that they will be reduced again for 2018. So we've done that calculation, so that 4% is now, for the average residential tax impact, is now 3.3%. So that is now our new starting point.
Kathy, I just want to ask and confirm my rough calculation